Well, it is an interview, and we want to share this on our YouTube channel, Dalit Voice and Vision.
Good.
And I have come to know about your writings, about your work, about your field work on India and South Asia. So we'll be talking more about the areas and focusing on caste in India. First, I would like you to introduce yourself for our audience.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Well, I'm David Mosse. I'm currently a social anthropologist at SOAS, University of London, in the Anthropology and Sociology department. I've been there 20 years now, or nearly 20 years. But I began my work as an anthropologist in India when I did research living in a village in southern Tamil Nadu, southeast of Madurai, in the early 1980s.
Oh.
And I'd had a long, well, not long at that stage, but I was always interested in the problem of caste, in the sense that I went out to study anti-caste movements, or I was looking for the expressions of the of egalitarianism within caste society. And so before doing my fieldwork, I'd read some of Ambedkar's work. I'd read stuff about the Bhakti movements. I'd read about various sort of social movements historically that had been movements against caste hierarchy. And I was interested to go back to southern India, to Tamil Nadu, where I'd worked as a volunteer in the late 70s, and to see what had been the experience of Dalit communities in their search for alternative ideologies, alternative identities. And for that reason I was particularly interested to look for devotional movements, other kinds of expressions, social expressions of equality. What I found was not a range as I'd expected to find, a range of indigenous, egalitarian, social and religious movements, although I had looked at some in some detail at the Dravidian movement as well. But what I found that historically one of the most significant things for the Dalit communities in southern India and Tamil Nadu had been their encounter with missionary organizations and their adoption of Christianity. So I wanted to select a village in which some of the Dalits were Christians and some of the Dalits were Hindus, and in a mixed caste community to try to understand the relationship between religion, caste, hierarchy, equality, social mobility, change over longer historical periods of time.
So you found Bhakti movement as empowerment of the Dalits and low caste in southern India?
No, there was in the literature quite a lot of work about the Bhakti movements, but when I was looking for movements of liberation and change among Dalit communities in Tamil Nadu, I couldn't find the such movements, at least not that were currently present and currently active. And I mean, there were one or two, and I did visit various centres and shrines in different parts of Tamil Nadu, especially in the south, Tirunelveli and Kanyakumari. But I settled on this village in what was then Ramnath district because it had an interesting history of Dalits who had become Christians at different historical times. Some of them had become Christians way back in the late 17th century, converted by Jesuit missionaries. Some of them were converted in the late 19th and the first half of the 20th century by Protestant missionaries. Some of them even more recently had become Pentecostal Christians. So in various ways I was interested in, were Dalits finding within Christianity an alternative identity? Were they finding a challenge to caste hierarchy and caste differences? And was that, as has often been supposed, was that the driving force for conversion to the Christian religion. In fact, I discovered something much more complicated about Christianity and the ways in which caste hierarchies and caste inequality and complex caste relations get reproduced within Christian traditions, Catholic traditions and others, and that religion is not actually foundational of people's identities, but caste is. And so I was quite, so then I spent quite a bit of time trying to understand this changing historical relationship between caste society on the one hand and religious affiliation to religious traditions which are in principle egalitarian, anti-caste, emphasize the unity and of all humanity. So that was what I have explored in some considerable detail in a book that was published just a few years ago, The Saint in the Banyan Tree.
Yeah, Saint in the Banyan Tree. Will you speak a little bit more about this book? I mean, the title is very exciting, you say.
Well, the title, people often think of of Hinduism as a banyan tree, a complex tree that has roots, lateral growing roots and shoots that come up from the ground, and a complex, ever expanding, all embracing tradition. But so on the one hand, the banyan tree is a metaphor for Indian society, Hindu society, caste society. On the other hand, actually the inspiration for the title came from a very particular banyan tree. And this is a banyan tree that in the letters written by Jesuit missionaries in the early 18th century, late 17th, early 18th century, around 1730 or so, you'll find letters where the Jesuits are writing about a famous pilgrimage centre. And the pilgrimage centre is centred on a banyan tree, a sacred banyan tree. And it's the banyan tree of Sandiakapa, which is the Tamil name for St. James the Greater. And this, the story goes, a cutting from the tree was brought by 4 Bala caste brothers, that's 4 Dalit caste brothers from a shrine on the coast of Tamil Nadu, and they brought it after the miraculous healing of their sister. And they brought this tree and they planted it in the village, and then there was that became a sort of sacred shrine established by a Dalit community. And that shrine established by a Dalit community, a sort of heterodox, somewhat hybrid, sort of half Christian, Hindu, not really part of established religion, but a very popular centre of power, religious power, healing and so on, then became incorporated. Well, the first thing that happened is like many of these powerful shrines, they became subject to the patronage of the royal, of the kings and the rulers. So there were grants made and support made to the deity, just as the rulers were also patronising Hindu shrines, they were patronising this shrine. And then much later, this shrine became incorporated into the Jesuit missionary that had begun with Robert de Nobili in Madurai in the 17th century. So what you have is a Dalit shrine that then becomes incorporated into wider and wider political structures, political and religious structures, which then end up marginalising the Dalits, because in the end, by the time the shrine is established, the Dalits are not actually even permitted to, in the early days, participate in the communion inside the church. They have to stand outside the church and receive communion outside the church. So there's an interesting sort of shift of Dalit power into Dalit subordination as this shrine becomes institutional. I mean, it's a long and complicated story.
It's very interesting to know about this title and then to explore and to know its metaphoric value and then its social and political value as well as its religious value. And of course it takes me to immediately, but your explanation gives it another kind of dimension that happened in South, okay, instead of in North. Well, in North and South, I mean, do you see any much difference in caste identity and caste hierarchy or like that? And briefly, did you ever do any comparative study of this?
I've not done any proper comparative studies, so my knowledge is much more based on the South. I mean, just quickly to stick with caste and Christianity, because there is a contrast there between North and South. What happened in this church that was emerged out of this banyan tree was, first of all, the incorporation of caste into Christianity, because upper castes had converted, dominant caste, privileged caste had converted, and there was a caste hierarchy within Catholicism which had excluded the Dalits. But you had a complicated multi-caste Christianity. In the North, most of the conversions to Christianity were from the Dalit castes. So you don't find that complex hierarchies of caste within Christianity. And that has some implications as to how Dalit Christians have responded to the experience of discrimination within the church, within the churches, in different churches to different degrees, in the South as opposed to in the North. There are obviously differences, but it's hard to draw hard and fast comparisons. Things like Varna categories don't really have the salience in the South that they have in the North, although there's a clear distinction between Brahmins on the one hand and the other castes which are in sort of Varna terms, Shudras. The most salient distinctions in the day-to-day caste relations in much of Tamil Nadu, especially in rural, but not only rural Tamil Nadu, is between what are nowadays called the backward castes and the Dalits. So it's the backward castes are the dominant castes, the landowning and politically powerful castes, whether it's the Teras in the south, the Banyas in the north.
There is a myth about backward caste, because the upper layer of the land owning backward caste is a very small layer, whereas most of the backward castes who did never own land, who were artisans, okay, for example, working as carpenters or tailors or painters or potters, or all of these castes did never have any land, but land owning community is very little. So don't you think that in OBC itself a kind of hegemony has actually operated over the most OBC people, the hegemony of the elite OBC?
Well, I think the categorizations are very regional and very specific, and so you do need to look at things in their particular context. So there are areas, whole regions where there has been historically a dominant landowning caste, which nowadays is classified as backward caste. But they have, for all intents and purposes, been the dominant caste, such as the Gaundas in the western region. Now, in other areas, there's been quite a shift as the major landowning castes, such as the Brahmins or the Vellalas, particularly in the rich, fertile valley areas, where these forward castes had over periods of time sold land, moved into urban centres and pursued urban and professional occupations. And then other castes had come in, not the Dalits, but other castes to become more powerful landowners. So there's been some areas where you have a long historical continuity of a particular dominant caste that is nowadays a backward caste, others where there's been that shift and the current landowners, but those are different, as you say, from the artisan caste, from the carpenters and the potters and but those caste groups are numerically not so large, because they would also be dispersed between villages. Any one village is going to have a few, a small number of barbers, potters, and so on. Although sometimes you have whole villages. Where I did my work in southern Tamil Nadu, you'd have whole villages which were potter caste villages, and they would serve and make pots and distribute them in all the villages around.
Okay, right. Well, David, you've written several books and articles, and within this given time, it's not possible to talk individually about each work, which is very important and significant. But I take some phrases and concepts from your work, and I would like you to elaborate onto that. For example, social analysis as corporate product. So, do you think that academic world is drifting away from social analysis as corporate product, or?
Well, that's a title from an article which refers to a very different kind of site for fieldwork.
Okay.
So, in being specific, that was an article based on fieldwork which I did at the headquarters of the World Bank in Washington.
Okay.
So instead of studying a village in southern Tamil Nadu, I was studying as a village the professional lives of non-economics, social scientists in the headquarters of the World Bank. And the argument there is about how difficult it has been to build social science perspectives. By social science perspectives, I mean perspectives which focus on relationships, the relationality of social life, that look at power relations, that look at the way that institutions work in terms of the dynamic of power relations, how very difficult it is to build that kind of social knowledge into institutions like the World Bank, which are dominated by economists. Now, what tends to happen in such institutions is social knowledge or understandings of society tends to be produced in a way that allows it to be an attribute of individuals, of groups, of regions, of countries. Hence you have a notion like social capital, which can be something that can be seen as an attribute that can be aggregated. Then you can run regression analysis and look for correlations between the amounts of social capital you have and poverty reduction and other kinds of variables. Now that's a very different approach from the relationality. And what my paper was arguing was that the non-economist social scientists find themselves in the business of having to package their understanding, their understanding of social relations into forms that could be sold to the wider organisations. So because the idea of society and of social and power relations is quite incompatible with certain kinds of organisational processes. So it's a product. It's the creating of social analysis as a product. In order for it to be taken up within certain kinds of organisations.
Research as a form, but as a commodity.
Exactly.
Which traps even the researcher within it. And then, of course, you have written out about power relations, poverty reduction, then caste, class, and reproduction of privilege, and knowledge and relationality. When I look at all these phrases, I find that your approach as a social anthropologist has been very innovative and has been to challenge even existing philosophy and methodology of understanding the social reality. So does it fall a certain category in social anthropology, or it is an outcome of your 30 years struggle in academics and also as an anthropologist living with people, that you realize that the methodology has to be, very people-centric?
I think probably the latter. I've never tried to organize my work in terms of a particular school of thought or build consistently from a particular, within a particular theoretical perspective. I've tended to regard theory as a tool that's useful to help pose the right question of the particular, often complex social situation that I'm trying to understand and trying to explain. So social theory has a purpose, it's a tool, it's a way of, particularly a way of asking an unfamiliar question, a question that you might not otherwise think to ask, and enriching your repertoire of questions to ask.
Well, there is one writing, the title of which is Misunderstood, Misrepresented and Contested, Anthropological Knowledge Production in Question. So what we just talked, there is a reference in this to this conversation. I mean, misunderstood, misrepresented, contested, an anthropological question, knowledge production in question. Does it? Can we interpret this in terms of caste also?
That I don't know, because possibly. I mean, yes, I think caste is misunderstood and misrepresented, or rather, there is certainly a bias increasingly a bias in understanding caste. Interestingly enough, when I first was involved in studying Indian society in the early 80s, almost all of the studies about caste were about caste and power and dominance, and they were about caste as a means of securing superiority and power and privilege. Nowadays, if you talk about caste, people tend to assume that you're talking about Dalits, that caste is a problem of subordination, of inequality and so on. And what's got rather lost from the picture is caste as a continuing aspect of the production of privilege. So we have an asymmetry in which at the top we have ideas of merit, of freedom from caste, of castelessness, and it's as if caste has become the responsibility and the psychological and other kinds of sociological load of those subordinated within the system. And I think that's a balance that needs to be that's something that needs to be rebalanced, so that caste is actually understood as part of the continuing production of privilege, and not simply something which is the problem of Dalits and other subordinated groups, because there's always we're dealing with caste as a relational phenomena, and the circumstances of one group is a consequence of the position and the capacity of another group to hoard its opportunities, which therefore has an excluding effect on another group. So I think there is a misrepresentation in some ways of the way that. Do you mind making myself clear? I mean, I think.
It's interesting. I mean, that there are different poles in caste, and in the polemics of caste now, just one pole is referred. The rest of the poles disappear. And whereas the production of privilege, is going to all the poles. So it's very interesting to understand caste like this.
And there was there was much more of a focus on that, when I began my research. At which time there were hardly any studies of Dalit communities. Almost none. Well, that's a slight exaggeration, but very few in the late 70s and early 80s.
Yeah, in discussions, for example, in university, etc., when we utter the word caste, then all the people immediately assume that the speaker is going to talk about Dalits.
Yes.
So this is, misunderstood or misrepresented
Yes.
and contested.
Yes.
Okay. Now.
Although that's not that particular
that's
particular paper was about a different kind of
different context. I know.
Yeah.
But it's research with the with very challenging tools. Is useful for a person like me, for example, who is not a social anthropologist. But when I look at your works, most of these concepts, etc., I find very useful for literary analysis, for cultural analysis, for analysis of caste, for analysis of hierarchy, analysis of ideology. Yeah. So in that context, I took it, and anthropological knowledge production in question. Could you a little bit elaborate this? Because this question is a very important area.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about conventionally or historically, when you think of what anthropologists did, anthropologists were people who would travel to far off places and undertake research in communities that were far removed from their own society, and it was trying to understand in depth the life, the world, the social meaning of another community as part of building a picture of the diversity of cultural forms, of ways of being human. And there was the world of the anthropologists and the world of those that they studied were really separated by distance, time, culture, language, and so on. So there was no question that those who were written about in anthropological texts would come and interrogate the anthropologists and say, why have you represented us in this way? Is this a true representation? On what basis have you made these statements? How are you making these inferences? Nowadays, the world is much more interconnected, and so knowledge and centres of knowledge production are much more interconnected. So what anthropologists produce by way of their interpretive accounts of the world, or institutions, or subcultures, or communities, moves in the same world and circles as do those as do the products of their research. So there's much more interaction between researchers and those they're writing about, they're researching, and much more opportunity for questioning, for challenging. So it's in that sense that anthropological knowledge is in question in the way that it hasn't been in question in the former, older, traditional style of anthropology that separates out those who are the worthy objects of inquiry and anthropological writing. So we now have a position where all knowledge or knowledge produced from one particular location can also be set up against knowledge produced from another location. They exist together. The social scientist's claim to know is not given for granted. It can always be subject to question from other forms of knowledge, whether it's knowledge from experience, knowledge from belonging to a community, as well as, of course, knowledge from other disciplines.
Of course, questioning is a very challenging thing, and there is always possibility of having a circular kind of questioning, which may ultimately lead to reproduce the answer. So in that sense, I find it very interesting. Well, you have also worked on caste in Britain. Could you a little bit tell us about what is the finding of your study about caste in Britain, because normally we always think about caste in India, you know. So this caste in Britain, I mean, what is this phenomenon?
Well, I mean, I've worked as part of a multidisciplinary team, along with your friend Meena Danda,
Right.
Annapurna Wargray, David Keane, and others.
Yeah.
And in particular, when the UK Parliament voted to make discrimination on the basis of caste illegal in 2013, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission invited this team of researchers, of which I was one, to work to develop work on developing the secondary legislation, how to implement this law. So there were lots of questions that had to be asked about how legislation on caste discrimination would be implemented, what would be the problems, what would be the issues. And so we we brought together experts, and there was a lot of evidence from independent research and from government commissioned research about the existence of caste discrimination, in the sense of discrimination that would be subject to law. That's not private questions of marriage and relationships and so on, but things to do with employment, bullying in school, things like in the health service, in work and in education. So we were charged with having a consultation not only with the experts but also with representatives from different organizations. The Dalit organizations, Ambedkarite organizations, Valmiki organizations, and others who had campaigned for the introduction of anti-discrimination legislation. And also those organizations who had taken a strong stand against such legislation, Hindu organizations of various kinds in particular. So it's become a very contentious issue, but the contention is based on some very uneven perspectives. So those who are subject to an experience and have extensive experience of being discriminated against speak from their experience of discrimination, whereas those who challenge the legislation do so on the basis that this is unnecessary, that it will produce additional and secondary and unanticipated problems and questions. Now, there's a very difficult tension between people and communities who speak from experience and those who speak in a way that denies that experience or doesn't take that experience into account, and in a sense transform that claim to being harmed by caste into a different claim, which is to be harmed on the basis of their religion. So if certain Hindu organizations would claim that caste legislation is a form of religious discrimination against the Hindus. The caste and caste relations and caste discrimination has a different form in the UK, and it exists in a society where different identity is privileged in different ways because of the way the government system works as well. So it tends to be the case that religious identities are identities that are salient in people's minority status. If it's not racial identities or ethnicity. Caste, of course, has no place, and neither would it, in fact, under any legislative change, have a place, because the legislative process is only about certain specific kinds of discrimination. It's not about requiring people to identify according to caste any more than is currently the case.
You see this responding to subordination and the ideology and politics of community participation. You see, in caste structure, there is always discrimination, and it's that turns into, you know, a kind of distress, and it's very difficult to manage by all those people who actually are treated in a discriminated manner, from social discrimination, economic discrimination, and so on and so forth. And it actually affects the well-being or the social health of the entire community. What measures would you suggest to deal with this issue?
Sorry, to deal with the issue
with
of...
the issue of caste discrimination and then distress. And as a social anthropologist, do you think that there are certain forms which can actually deal with and teach how to cope with this kind of distress, besides being part of a political movement? Can there be other forms as well?
I think a political movement is a certain kind of solidarity, but there are many other kinds of solidarity that are known to be empowering. Whether it's youth, Dalit youth coming together in villages and talking about their experiences, or Dalit women coming together and sharing experience, or whether people realizing the strength that they can have by acting collectively, even to get some of their basic needs. And I think one of the characteristics of the sense of Dalit disempowerment or lack of power is that Dalits need to organize even to get the simplest things, to get an electricity connection to the village, or to get the road extended, or to get the water extended. Those in privileged positions don't have to mobilize in groups in order to make representation to the Tahsildar's office or whatever. But Dalits tend to need that collective strength, because of their claims and their demands can easily be overlooked. So I think there are a range of forms of collectivity that are helpful. But I think that institutions have a role to play also. And Babasaheb Ambedkar was very committed to the role of institutions, as well as the importance of organizing people, the importance of law, the importance of structures that create a framework within which freedoms and entitlements can be claimed. And so I think that institutions have a really important part to play, if only to demonstrate how relationships of equality and justice can take shape and should take shape. But again, if I can take the third clue, if we start with people organising themselves, and then we look at the institutional structures that create the spaces for those organisations and mean that that people's organisation and collectivities has to be taken account of. The third part, and this again comes from Babasaheb Ambedkar, is that slightly less tangible sense of worth and of belonging and of being, which he found in Buddhism, and which pays attention to the potential, the actual inner harms that any system of exploitation and disregard places on people individually. And I think that Dalits have never separated out the material and the political and the religious. There's always been, if you look historically, a mixing up of these things. The religious movements that we talked about are attending to emotional needs, and they're also attending to material needs. They're also attending to the need to have institutions and structures that can be in their control. And I think structures being in the control of Dalits is very important, because I think a lot of change comes about through the good intentions of people trying to do things for Dalits, but that's a very different thing from having institutions and structures in which Dalits are themselves in charge and in control, and that is it seems to me a very important part of the way forward.
Okay. Yeah, and for example, in last 30-40 years, Dalit literature has come up.
Yeah, that's another area of exploration and strength from sharing of experiences.
Yes. And a certain form like autobiography has become very central form.
Yeah.
Experience has actually now replaced the so-called idea of aesthetics, which is constructed out of imagination, but actually not showing the social realities.
Yes.
That's right.
Picking up on experience, but also taking experiences that have been harmful and humiliating, and trying to change those memories also. I think some of the things that are quite striking in my understanding of what's happening in South India is the way in which the emergence of a Dalit writing, but also Dalit theology, Dalit religion, Dalit culture, is about taking certain signs and symbols of humiliation, drums, drumming, dance forms, and turning those into celebrations of something that is distinctive and honourable and possessed by Dalits as their own. Because my understanding, reading about historically, the oppression of Dalits has also been an attempt by dominant society to deny honour to a certain section of society, to deny culture to a section of society, to define people by their absence, that they don't have honour, they don't have self-respect. And every time Dalits have attempted to make public claims to that self-respect, to that honour,